Over the course of the Second World War, Germany built more tank destroyers than tanks, and almost none of them were planned. They were reactions. A new enemy tank shows up that they can't kill, so they panic, find a bigger gun, bolt it onto whatever chassis is available, and send it to the front. And what came out of that process ranged from cheap improvised junk held together with gun shields and optimism to some of the most powerful armored vehicles ever built. Some of those solutions were brilliant, some were disasters, and some were both at the same time. So today, we're telling you the whole story about them, one by one, all the way to the end. And it starts with a problem that quite accidentally created the first thing that would turn out to be the greatest tank destroyer of the Second World War. During World War I, every major offensive ran into the same problem. Infantry would go forward, they'd push through the first line of trenches, maybe the second, and then they'd stall, because the artillery that got them there couldn't follow. Horse-drawn field guns weighed tons, and they were trying to cross ground that had been churned into moonscape by their own shell fire. And the communication between the guys at the front, who needed fire support, and the gun battery sitting a mile behind them was never reliably solved. So what kept happening over and over was that assault troops would advance beyond the range of their own guns and find themselves standing in the open against fortified positions. And they died in enormous numbers because of it. After the war, German officers spent years trying to figure out how the next war should be fought. And the idea that kept surfacing was that infantry needed its own armored, mobile, direct fire support weapon, something that could physically roll forward with the foot soldiers. While they were building what would eventually become Blitzkrieg, the Germans wanted to solve this specific problem with a concept they called assault artillery. And that's where this whole story begins. Here's the situation with German armor when the war broke out, because you need to understand how this system was supposed to work before you can understand how it fell apart. The Germans wanted one weapon to deal with enemy tanks and one to support infantry with high explosive fire. Two roles clearly separated. The tank killer was the Panzer III. It carried a high-velocity 3.7 centimeter gun, the KWK-36, same caliber as the infantry's towed PaK-36 anti-tank gun. And given the armor that existed at the time, the 37mm worked just fine. The turret ring in the Panzer III was deliberately made large enough to accept a 50mm gun that was already being planned as the next step. The infantry support role needed a bigger caliber for high explosive power. That was the Panzer IV, which they called the accompanying vehicle. It was meant to roll alongside the Panzer IIIs and clear the path of everything that wasn't an enemy tank. It carried a short-barreled 75mm gun, basically a howitzer on tracks, designed to lob explosive shells into bunkers, field positions, whatever the infantry needed gone. And then there was the third vehicle, the Stug 3. A self-propelled assault gun built on the Panzer III chassis, but instead of a turret, it had a fixed superstructure, a low-armored box called a casemate. It carried the same short-barreled 75mm gun as the Panzer IV. Both the Panzer IV and the Stug 3 were meant to do the same job: blast bunkers, support infantry, keep pace with the advance. Basically armored escort artillery. The difference was how they carried the gun. The Panzer IV had a turret that could rotate and engage targets in any direction. The Stug 3 could only aim about 12 degrees to either side. Anything beyond that, you had to turn the whole vehicle. But no turret meant it was cheaper to build, it sat lower to the ground and was harder to spot. And you could put thicker frontal armor on it for the same overall weight. Trade-offs. So that's the system at the start of the war. 3 vehicles, 2 jobs: kill enemy tanks, support your infantry. Logical and designed for a world where enemy tanks had thin armor and the 37mm was enough to deal with them. That world lasted about 8 months. The problem was that tanks were getting heavier and their armor was getting thicker, and this gun was about to earn itself a nickname, Door Knocker, a gun that knocked politely on the enemy's armor, and nothing more. The first warning signs came already during the invasion of Poland. Some of the better armored tanks, like the French Hotchkiss H-35s that were present with Polish forces, took multiple hits and kept going. But Poland fell so fast that the problem was easy to brush aside. France was a completely different story. German anti-tank crews discovered very quickly that their gun was nearly useless against the best Allied armor. The French Char B1 had 60mm of frontal armor, and it proved almost completely immune to the Pak-36. There's a famous incident when a single Char B1 named Ure attacked and destroyed 13 German tanks, was hit 140 times, and not a single round got through. The British Matilda II was just as bad, if not worse. 78mm of frontal armor, more than double what the Pak-36 could penetrate at any range. German forces had to improvise. They used outflanking tactics and pulled 88mm anti-aircraft guns into the anti-tank role, because those were the only weapons that could actually kill these things. But the 88s were rare at the divisional level. They were huge, difficult to move, and they were never designed for this job. You couldn't hand every infantry division facing enemy armor an 88mm flak gun and call that a solution. Germany needed something better, and they needed it fast. Now, even before the French campaign began, German planners had already recognized that the Pak-36 wasn't going to be enough against well-armored French tanks. The 5cm Pak-38, which would have been a significant improvement, was still in development and nowhere near ready for mass production. So they came up with a stopgap. They took captured Czechoslovak Škoda 4.7cm anti-tank guns, which were available in large numbers, and they mounted them on the chassis of the Panzer I light tank. The Panzer I was already quite obsolete as a fighting tank at that point, armed with just 2 machine guns and thin armor, but it was also available in numbers. So, the concept was simple. Remove the Panzer I's turret, bolt in the Czech anti-tank gun on a pedestal mount, protect the crew behind a gun shield, and the result was the Panzerjäger 1, Germany's first purpose-built tank destroyer. Now don't laugh at it. This was still the very beginning, and you're about to see just how quickly, and perhaps more interestingly, how absurdly this concept would evolve. The crew was 3 men, a driver enclosed in the hull, and a gunner and loader/commander standing in the open fighting compartment, exposed from the waist up behind a gun shield of just 14mm of armor. For German anti-tank gunners who had spent weeks watching their 37mm rounds bounce off enemy tanks, the Panzerjäger 1 was, at first, a relief, but the problems showed themselves immediately, which you'd probably expect from pairing an obsolete tank with an obsolete anti-tank gun. The gun still struggled badly at anything beyond point-blank range. However, the idea of merging tanks and anti-tank guns was interesting, and the Germans were going to play with it and see just how far they could push it. The problem was that by the summer of 1941, Germany faced an anti-tank crisis far more severe than anything it had encountered in France. When Operation Barbarossa began, the invasion of the Soviet Union, German intelligence had almost completely missed the existence of the Soviet KV-1 and T-34 tanks, or at least their existence in any problematic numbers. They thought it would be a similar scenario to France, a small number of well-armored tanks that could be handled with tactics and air power, making up for the lack of penetrating power. They were wrong. On the second day of the invasion, German units began encountering something completely different. The T-34's 45mm of armor, sloped at 60 degrees, gave effective protection equivalent to roughly 90mm of vertical plate. German 50mm rounds ricocheted off at ranges beyond 500 meters. The KV-1 was even worse, 75mm of armor all around, and in some spots more, making it virtually immune to every standard German weapon. The 50mm gun, which was just beginning to replace the 37 on the Panzer III, was virtually useless from any angle against the KV-1. Soviet tanks were getting hit tens of times before something finally broke and made the crew bail out. There were numerous accounts of them advancing completely unfazed by anti-tank fire, destroying German tanks, driving over the anti-tank guns, and killing the crews with machine guns. It was a genuine shock, and the Soviet tanks were also in far greater numbers than the Germans had expected. So, here's what happened next. The 50mm was the absolute limit of what the Panzer III's turret ring could physically accept. By 1942, the Panzer III was a dead end as a fighting tank. It would continue in production for a while, and the final version ironically mounted the same short-barreled 75mm howitzer that the Panzer IV was getting rid of, essentially swapping roles and becoming an infantry support vehicle instead. Production stopped entirely in 1943, but the Panzer III's chassis, which was proven, reliable, and already being mass-produced, had a second life ahead of it, because that chassis was what the Stug III was built on. The Panzer IV, on the other hand, had something the Panzer III didn't: a larger turret ring. It had always been the bigger, heavier vehicle, and that extra space meant it could physically accept a much more powerful gun